Post-nuclear driving test, assessor's log, candidate species 7441, humanity, filed 2022, local reckoning. There is a form for this. There is a form for everything. I want that on the record before I begin because what follows will read, to the committee, like the testimony of an examiner who has lost discipline. I have not lost discipline. I have lost something more difficult to replace, which is the comfortable certainty that I understood the rules of my own profession. I would like the committee to lose it too. That is the only honest outcome I can offer. My designation is AVETH of the 6th Conclave Assessment Bureau. For 412 of your years, I have administered the test. I have passed 19 species and failed 31. I have watched candidates dissolve into self-inflicted silence. I have watched others mature slowly into the careful adulthood that the galaxy requires of anyone permitted to hold the keys. I considered myself good at this. I considered the test sound. Then the file for candidate 7441 reached my desk, and I learned that the species had not applied. Test. For those of the committee unfamiliar with field procedure, and I am told there are now several of you who have never left the conclave spires, allow me to explain what the test actually is, because the popular understanding of it is sentimental and wrong. The galaxy is old, and the galaxy is full of dangerous machinery. Not weapons, primarily, though there are those. Truly dangerous machines are the ordinary ones. The reactors that warm a planet's cities, the engines that fold distance, the agricultural lattices that feed a billion mouths and could, with one inverted instruction, starve them. Power, in our understanding, is not a thing you are given. It is a thing you are handed the controls of while it is already moving. So we test. Before any species is granted what the older translations call sovereignty over consequence, the right to operate faster than light drives, to seed worlds, to build the engines that no overseer can switch off in time, that species must demonstrate that it can be trusted at the wheel. The metaphor is not mine. It is built into the oldest assessment doctrine, and it predates my bureau by such a margin that no one remembers the original drivers. You do not hand the keys to a vehicle to a creature who has never crashed, and you do not hand them to a creature who has crashed and learned nothing. You hand them to the one who crashed, understood precisely why, and changed. In practice, this means the test is administered in simulation. We give the candidate a closed problem, a model civilization, a model engine, a model crisis, and we watch how they drive. Careful ones break early. The clever ones read the road. The wise ones, and they are rare, understand that the most dangerous thing on any road is the conviction that they themselves are a good driver. Most species, given the simulation, behave as you would hope a nervous applicant behaves. They proceed slowly. They check their mirrors, in the local idiom. They treat the lethal machine as a lethal machine, with the reverence of someone who has read the manual and believed it. We have a saying in the Bureau: show me a species that has never frightened itself, and I will show you a species that has never driven. I did not, until recently, understand how much that saying was hiding. 2. The anomaly candidate 7441 did not arrive through the application pathway. There was no petition, no preliminary contact, no humble delegation requesting evaluation. There was, instead, a flag from the survey arm, a routine flag, the kind we receive when a sub-threshold species does something marginally interesting, like split an atom or build a transmitter loud enough to be heard by accident. The flag said, "Contridiant operating heavy machinery, unsupervised, no license on record. Recommend assessment." I assumed an error. We do not find candidates already driving. The entire architecture of the test assumes we reach a species before it can hurt anyone but itself, ideally before it can hurt itself badly. We meet them in the garage, so to speak, before they have the keys. The flag implied something procedurally impossible. A species that had located the keys on its own, started the engine on its own, and been operating the vehicle for some time without anyone in the passenger seat. Pulled the file, expecting to correct a clerical mistake. Instead, I read the survey summary, and then I read it again, and then I sat in the particular stillness that my species reserves for the moment a familiar floor proves to be a trapdoor. Humanity had built engines. Not folding engines. They had not yet found that door. But engines of every cruder kind, in numbers that defied the resource models. They had built vehicles that moved faster than any unaugmented sci-fi and then sold those vehicles by the hundreds of millions to ordinary members of the species with no assessment whatsoever beyond a brief examination of competence that any sufficiently patient adolescent could pass. They had built reactors. They had built the engines that fold distance's smaller cousin, chemical rockets, crude and magnificent, that they rode out of their own gravity while sitting atop columns of controlled explosion. They had done this in several documented cases, having calculated in advance a non-trivial probability that the first such ride would ignite their atmosphere and end them. They had checked the math. The math said probably not. They had gone anyway, and they had built. The survey arm flagged this in the dry red of a category we rarely invoke. Weapons sufficient to render their own world uninhabitable, not as an accident, not as an unforeseen byproduct. They had set out deliberately, with full understanding, to construct devices whose only function was to end everything, and they had succeeded. And then they had manufactured tens of thousands more. By every doctrine I have ever administered, candidate 7441 should not exist. A species that arms itself to the threshold of self-erasure does not survive to be assessed. That is the entire reason for the test. The test exists because of species like this, exists to stop them before they reach the threshold. Humanity had reached the threshold. Humanity had stood at the threshold for the better part of a century, holding the device, finger resting on it, and humanity was still here. I requested a full retroactive assessment. The committee, I will note for the record, was reluctant. There is no form for assessing a species after the fact, and you all know how I feel about the absence of a form. But I argued, and I prevailed, and the file was opened. I have regretted and not regretted that decision in equal measure every day since. 3. Reading the road. The retroactive assessment is in essence the same test run backward. Instead of presenting the candidate with a simulated crisis and observing their choices, we reconstruct the real crises they have already survived and observe the choices they actually made. It is more honest than the simulation. It is also far more disturbing because real crises do not come with the simulation's tidy boundaries. A real crisis can always get worse. I began where any assessor would, with the weapons. The whole question of the candidate's fitness turned on a single matter. Not that they had built the devices, which was damning, but what they had done with them. A species that builds the device and uses it is a failed candidate and usually a dead one. A species that builds the device and never comes close to using it is, frankly, a species that did not understand what it built. The interesting candidate, the one worth the assessment, is the one that builds the device, comes to the very edge of using it, and stops. I expected to find one such edge, a formative trauma, the single near miss that taught the species the weight of the wheel. I found, on first count, dozens. I want to walk the committee through only a few, because the full ledger is longer than any of you will read, and because the few are sufficient to make the point that the many only sharpen, was the incident the humans themselves barely recorded. A single individual, low in the chain of operation, stationed in a vessel beneath the surface of an ocean, cut off from communication, who received every indication his civilization's war had begun, and that doctrine required him to release his portion of the world-ending arsenal. His instruments said, fire, his training. Said fire, his superiors, those he could reach, lean toward fire. And this one individual, on the basis of nothing more transmissible than a feeling that the situation did not smell right, refused. He was not rewarded for this. For a long time he was not even thanked. He simply decided, alone, against every system designed to remove the decision from him, that he would not be the hand that ended the world. And the world, not knowing, went on. There was the other one, a different individual, watching a screen in a bunker, who saw the screen report that the enemy's missiles were already in the air. Multiple confirmations. The system shouting its certainty. Doctrine, again, was clear. His duty was to report up the chain so that the answering arsenal could be launched before it could be destroyed on the ground. He had minutes. He had less than minutes. And he looked at the screen reporting the end of everything and decided, with no authority to decide, on the strength of an intuition that a real attack would look different than this, that the screen was wrong. He sat on the alarm. He let the minutes pass. He was correct. The screen had been fooled by light off high clouds. He, too, was not rewarded. He was quietly disciplined, in fact, for the irregularity of having saved the species through insubordination. I read these and I assumed I had found the formative traumas. 2 individuals, 2 refusals, the species learning at the edge of the cliff what the cliff was for. Then I kept reading, and I understood that these were not the exceptions. These were Tuesdays. The candidate's history is studded with such moments. The misread radar, the training tape mistaken for the real alert, the rising bear interpreted as a bombing run, the satellite glare, the war game indistinguishable from a war. Again and again the machinery of the species drove itself to the very lip of the abyss. And again some individual human, or some small clot of them, looked over that lip and pulled the wheel. In assessment doctrine, we have a term for a candidate who survives a near miss. We call it the lesson a species typically requires 1. 2, if they are slow. I want to be precise about the scale, because precision is the only honesty available to me here. I tallied the documented occasions on which the candidate's world-ending machinery advanced towards use through error, malfunction, missed communication, or the simple momentum of a crisis that no one had decided to start. And I stopped the tally at a number that the committee will not believe, and that I have therefore appended in full, with sources, so that you may disbelieve it against the evidence. It is not a number you reach by being unlucky once. It is a number you reach by living at the edge of the cliff, by building your home there, by routing your daily traffic along its lip, by treating the drop not as a thing to retreat from, but as the ordinary scenery of your existence. Each one of those occasions was, on its own, the kind of moment that the test is designed to present a candidate exactly once, to see whether they survive it. Humanity faced it dozens of times and survived it dozens of times, and then went back to driving the same road. Faster. Humanity had the lesson available to them, fully understood, articulated in their own languages, taught in their own academies, and they kept building the road that led back to the cliff anyway. They kept driving it. They kept driving it. Fast. They wrote treaties to slow themselves and then strained against the treaties. They built the machines that would warn them of an attack and then learned, the hard way, that the machines would lie, would mistake the moon's rising for a swarm of incoming death, would mistake a flock of birds, would mistake a training exercise loaded into the wrong slot for the genuine end of the world. And having learned that the machines would lie, they kept the machines, and kept the arsenal the machines pointed toward, and went on living with their finger beside the device and their warning system crying, "Wolf," and they did not fire. This is the point at which my assessment ceased to follow the doctrine, because the doctrine has no category for this. The doctrine assumes that a near miss either kills you or corrects you. Humanity had taken its near misses the way a thrill seeker takes a steep grade, as information about how to take the next one slightly faster. I read the ledger a 3rd time looking for the moment the species learned the clean inflection after which the near misses stopped. And there is no such moment, because the learning is not the kind that ends the danger. The learning is the kind that survives it. They did not become a species that no longer comes to the edge. They became a species that has been to the edge so many times that the edge is familiar, and that has gotten, through sheer terrible repetition, very, very good at not going over IV. The way they drive. I want to describe the ordinary case now, because the committee will be tempted to dismiss the weapons as the behavior of a few unaccountable institutions, and to imagine that the species as a whole is more cautious than its arsenals suggest. I had this hope myself. I went looking for the cautious human. I did not find one. I found, instead, the most extraordinary relationship between a species and its own mortality that I have encountered in 400 years of looking. Consider the vehicle, the ground vehicle, the personal one, the metal shell on wheels that the humans manufacture by the 100 million and distribute, as I have said, to nearly any adult who can demonstrate the most rudimentary competence. Each one is a small engine of death. They are aware of this. They keep careful statistics on exactly how many of their own number these vehicles kill each year, and the number is enormous, a quiet, continuous attrition, a war the species wages against itself and does not call a war. A sensible species, confronted with this ledger, would do one of two things. It would stop building the vehicles, or it would refuse to operate them. Humanity does neither. Humanity climbs into the death engine every morning in numbers beyond counting and drives to work. They drive while tired. They drive while distracted. They drive while arguing, while eating, while their attention is anywhere but the lethal machine they are operating at speeds their bodies did not evolve to survive. They have a phrase for the brief lapse of attention that precedes most of the killing. They call it spacing out. They consider it normal. They consider it funny. And here is the thing that broke my assessment, the thing I have read and reread and cannot reconcile with any doctrine I know. They are good at it, not careful. Good. The same human who will, by their own admission, drive the death engine while half asleep and thinking about something else entirely will, in the instant a child steps into the road, execute a maneuver of such precise and instantaneous violence, the wheel, the brake, the weight of the entire machine, redirected in a fraction of a second, that the child lives and the human's heart rate, by their own reports, barely rises. They will do this without deciding to. The decision happens somewhere beneath the part of them that was spacing out. And then they will continue to their destination, and they will not file a report, and they will not request an assessment, and they will likely not even mention it at dinner. I located the records of their flying machines, larger death engines, faster, carrying hundreds at once at altitudes where the air itself will kill you. I expected here at least terror to win out and caution to reign, and it does. In the procedures, in the checklists, in the layered redundancy that I will grant is genuinely admirable. Beneath the procedures I found the same animal. I found the recorded voices of their pilots in the moments their machines tried to kill everyone aboard. Engines gone, instruments lying, the ground coming up. And what I heard was not panic. It was concentrations. It was the voice of a creature that had, somewhere in its history, decided that dying was an option it would consider only after it had exhausted every other one, and that it intended to be very thorough about the exhausting. There is a recording. The committee should hear it, and I have appended it, of a human flight crew whose machine had lost the power to all of its engines while still high above the ground, gliding, with no runway in reach. By every model, the machine and everyone in it was already dead. They simply had not arrived at the moment yet. And the recorded human voices in that interval are calm. They are working the problem. They are reading the checklist for a situation the checklist was never written to cover. And where the checklist runs out, they are improvising. And where the improvisation runs out, they are flying the broken machine toward the only flat thing they can see. Which happens to be a river, and they set the dead glider down on the water so gently that nearly everyone aboard walks away. And the human in command afterward, asked about the miracle of it, declines the word miracle, he says. In essence, that he had spent his entire life making small deposits into an account of experience, and that on that day he had made one large withdrawal. An account of experience as though near death were a savings discipline. I did not stop there, because by now I could not. I followed the death engines off the planet, into the void, where the margins are thinnest, and the species' particular genius shows clearest. I found the record of a crewed vessel, outbound to their moon, that suffered a catastrophic failure of its own power and life support partway through the void. A tank ruptured, the ship bleeding its breathable air and electrical capacity into the dark. 3 humans or a crippled machine on a trajectory that would carry them past any hope of rescue if they could not, with what little remained, bend their course back toward home. By every model available to me, they were dead. The ship that was meant to land them had become a dying box. The doctrine of every careful species says that at this point, you transmit your farewells and you conserve your dignity. What the humans did instead was take the other machine. The small descent craft meant only to carry 2 of them down to the moon's surface and never intended to sustain 3, never intended to fly the long way home, never rated for anything resembling the task now demanded of it. And they turned it into a lifeboat. They powered down the dying ship to a near corpse to hoard its last reserves. They did arithmetic, by hand, on the consumption of breathable air, and discovered that the lifeboat's scrubbers were the wrong shape to fit the dying ship's filters, an incompatibility that would let the exhaled poison build until it killed them. And then, with the materials aboard, with tape and cardboard and the cover of a manual and a sock, they built an adapter. Their controllers on the ground built it first, from the identical junk in a room, to prove it could be done, and then read the instructions up to the void. And the humans in the lifeboat assembled the impossible thing with their hands and breathed. They flew the dead ship home. They aimed it by eye, through a window, using the line of their own world's horizon against the crosshairs. Because the instruments that should have aimed it were powered down to keep them alive. They threaded a corridor in the sky, narrower than doctrine believes a hand-flown machine can thread, and they came down through their own atmosphere, in the one part of the vessel that had survived, and they landed in their ocean, alive, all three. And the species treated this not as the statistical impossibility it was, but as a success. A problem encountered and solved, filed under the heading of what we do. They have a phrase from that flight that the whole species adopted afterward, that the lattice rendered for me as a flat assertion that failure was not among the available outcomes. They say it now about taxes. They say it about minor inconveniences. They took the single most desperate improvisation in their history, and they made it into a figure of speech. And then, because the file is bottomless, I found the others. The ones who did not get a clever escape. Because the machine that failed them was not a vehicle but a reactor. One of the planetary engines I described. Gone wrong in the worst way an engine of that kind can go wrong, spilling invisible death into the air of their own world. The careful response, the only response, is to evacuate and let the poison run its course at whatever cost. The humans evacuated. And then a number of them went back in. Not in ignorance, they understood. Precisely, in the units their own science had invented, for exactly this, how much of the invisible death each minute inside would deposit in their bodies. They understood that for some of them the going in was a sentence. That they were trading years of their own lives, or the whole remainder of them, to keep the wound from spreading to the rest. There were ones who waded into flooded dark beneath the failing engine to open a valve that had to be opened by a hand, knowing what the water around them was. There were ones who shoveled, in shifts measured in seconds because a minute was too much to bury the wound. They did the arithmetic of their own deaths, and they decided the arithmetic was acceptable, and they went in. And a great many of them did not come out, or came out already dying, and the spread was stopped. There is no recovery in that one. There is no clever river landing, no taped-together lifeboat. There is only the wheel pulled hard at the cost of the driver, so that everyone in the other lane lives. I added it to the file beside the lifeboat and the dead glider on the river, and I understood that they were the same entry. The species does not distinguish between the save that costs nothing and the save that costs everything. It only distinguishes between the wheel pulled and the wheel not pulled. They pull the wheel. That is the whole of the doctrine they wrote in their own bones without an examiner to teach it. When the machine turns on you, you do not let go of the wheel, whatever the wheel costs to hold. This is what I mean when I say I found no cautious human. Caution is not the point. The caution is just the road they build between the crashes. The thing humanity is actually good at. The thing it has been training for in every death engine it has ever climbed into is the recovery. The save. The skid that should have killed them. Unskidded by reflexes honed across 10,000 smaller skids that did not quite. You do not get those reflexes from caution. You get them from a long, statistically appalling history of nearly dying and refusing to v. The interview doctrine permits, in retroactive assessment, a single point of direct contact, one representative of the candidate species, selected at random from the operating population, interviewed under controlled conditions, and returned with no memory of the event. I have used this provision perhaps a dozen times in my career. I used it here because the file had stopped making sense to me, and I wanted to look one of them in whatever they used for an eye and ask the question the file could not answer. Provision selected at random, an individual of no particular distinction, an operator of one of the ground death engines, a transporter of goods by profession, middle-aged, Unremarkable in every metric the survey records. I will not reproduce the full transcript. The committee has it. I will reproduce the part that ended my old understanding of the test. I asked the human about the driving. I asked, through the careful filters of the translation lattice, why a species so demonstrably aware of how often its machines killed it would continue to operate those machines with such apparent inattention. I expected denial, or shame, or the defensive reflex that lesser candidates display when their failings are named. The human thought about it. That is the first thing I should report. The human thought about it, turned the question over, took it seriously, in a way that suggested no one had ever asked, and that the human found the asking reasonable. Then the human said, and I have the translation lattice's confidence rating, at the maximum it goes, that you cannot drive afraid. The human said that the new ones, the young ones who have not yet been driving long, are dangerous precisely because they are careful, because they grip the wheel and watch the speed. All of this is slow, and that all of this thinking is slow, and the road does not wait for slow. The human said that you have to get to where the machine is part of your body, where you are not deciding to brake but simply braking the way you would flinch from a flame, and that you only get there by driving the machine until it stops frightening you, by accepting, the human said, that the machine can kill you, and then climbing into it anyway, every day, until the fear has been worn down into something faster than fear. I asked the human whether this was not simply recklessness, dressed up as philosophy. The human laughed. I have learned what the laugh is by now, and it was not a hostile one, and said something that the lattice rendered as, there's no such thing as a safe driver. There's only drivers who haven't crashed yet, and drivers who have crashed and figured out why. I did not tell the human that this is, very nearly word for word, the oldest line in the doctrine I have spent my life administering. I did not tell the human that my entire profession is built on a sentence this individual had just reconstructed, unprompted, from scratch, while explaining why they drive tired. I sat in the stillness, the trapdoor stillness, and I understood that I had been examining a species to see whether they had learned a lesson that they had not been taught, and did not need to be because they had derived it themselves in their bones, from a history of nearly dying that no examiner had to arrange because they had arranged it for themselves. Before the provision, returned the human, I asked one last question off the assessment script, which the committee may strike from the record if it offends procedure. I asked the human whether they were afraid of the weapons, the world-ending ones, the arsenals. The human was quiet for a long time. Then the human said yes. The human said that everyone was, the ones who thought about it, which was not enough of them. The human said it was the stupidest thing the species had ever made, and that the species knew it was the stupidest thing, and had made it anyway, and could not seem to unmake it, and that this kept some of them up at night. And then the human said, the thing I have not been able to put down. The human said, but we haven't used them. 60 years and we haven't used them. You don't understand how close it's been. You don't understand how many times someone could have and didn't. That's not luck. Luck runs out. That's people. Every single time, that was some person deciding not to. The lattice rated the human's emotional state, in that moment, as a near equal blend of shame and pride, an alloy my own species does not produce and does not have a word for. Returned the human to its road. See, the verdict I am required by the form to render a determination. I will render it, and then I will tell the committee what the form cannot hold. Determination. Candidate Species 7-41, humanity, is granted provisional sovereignty over consequence, with monitored conditions effective this filing. The doctrine supports this barely, on the following grounds. The candidate has demonstrated the survival of repeated existential miss without conversion to caution to catastrophe. The third path, one the doctrine does not formally recognize but which my predecessors clearly anticipated, since they built the wheel and crash metaphor that describes it perfectly. The candidate has built lethal machinery at planetary scale and operated it for generations with a self-inflicted death toll that is appalling in aggregate. And yet, set against the sheer volume of operation, vanishingly small per instance, the candidate has, most critically, held the world-ending device at the very edge of use, repeatedly across multiple independent crises, and has every single time found, at the level of the individual, beneath the level of doctrine and institution, a hand willing to pull the wheel. That is the formal case. Here is the rest of it. The committee will want to fail them. I felt the pull myself. Every instinct of our kind, every principle of careful stewardship, every value that makes the conclave, recoils from a species that drives like this. They are reckless. They are loud. They build the device, and they keep the device, and they cannot bring themselves to throw the device away, and they will, I have very little doubt, frighten the entire galaxy badly before they are done. They are exactly the species the test was built to stop. But I have spent 400 years stopping species at the garage, and I have come to a conclusion that I will set down here against the wishes of my own caution. The test, as we administer it, selects for a kind of driver that is safe on an empty road and useless on a real one. We have passed 19 careful species. We have watched several of them given the keys freeze. At the first crisis the simulation did not prepare them for, because they had never once in their history been forced to recover from a skid. They had never crashed. They did not know how to. Humanity knows how to crash. That is the whole of it. That is the terrible, magnificent core of the file. They have crashed so many times, in so many ways, against their own machinery and their own nature, that the recovery has become the most practiced reflex they own. You do not want them on your road. I grant it freely. If you are in the crash, if the engines are dead, and the ground is coming up, and the checklist has run out, there is no species in my 400 years I would rather have at the wheel, because there is no species that has spent more of its history refusing, at the last possible instant, against every indication and every doctrine, to die. I asked the human whether it was afraid of the weapons. I keep returning to the answer. That's not luck. That's people. Every single time, that was some person deciding not to. We built a test to find species who would never have to make that decision. Humanity is a species that has made it, by my count, several dozen times, each time alone, each time unthanked, each time with the entire weight of their world's machinery leaning the other way, and has made it correctly every time it mattered. I do not know if that will hold. Luck does run out. The human was right about that, and right that this was not luck. People run out too, eventually, or get tired, or get unlucky in the one crisis where no hand reaches the wheel in time. I have signed the provisional grant. I have not pretended to myself that it is safe. I have only concluded that safe was the wrong thing to have been measuring for all this time, and that I did not understand my own profession until a tired human in a transport told me, without knowing what they were correcting, that there is no such thing as a safe driver. There is only the one who crashed and understood why and got back in. Humanity got back in. They are, even now, getting back in. I have watched the records of them, strapping themselves to columns of fire and riding them off the planet year after year, having calculated the odds and gone anyway, and I have stopped reading it as recklessness. I have started reading it as the truest possible statement of what they are. A species that looked at every machine that could kill them, learned exactly how it would, and decided to drive it to the stars regardless, on the strength of nothing more than the conviction that they would figure out the skid when they got to it. They usually do. The committee may overrule me, the form permits it, but I will note, for whatever it is worth from an examiner who has lost his comfortable certainty and found something harder underneath it, that I would not want to be in the other lane when this species finally gets the keys to the fast machines, and that I find, to my own considerable unease, that I am glad they passed. Assessment closed, monitoring conditions appended, filed under protest of my own caution, which I have decided, in this single instance, to overrule. VETH 6th Conclave Assessment Bureau Addendum, personal, not for the form. I have requested a transfer to the monitoring detail for 7,441. The committee will assume morbid curiosity, and they will be partly right. Truer reason is this. I have administered the test for 400 years, and I have never once in all that time met a candidate I wanted to watch keep driving. I want to watch these ones keep driving. I want to see how far they get before the next skid, and I want to see them not die in it, the way they have not died in all the others. And I want, though it shames the careful part of me to write it down, To be there in the passenger seat, white-knuckled and appalled and exhilarated beyond anything my species has a word for, when they finally find the open road they have been training their whole reckless history to drive, they are going to terrify everyone. I cannot wait.